purely for raising my voice. I was then reported for bullying.
By whom? By the civil service? I wonder if Mark Carney will end up with Adele after he's stepped down.
Are you very possibly? Or Beyonce? I don't know. Everyone who might be considered eligible would be seen as an establishment figure. If you want an anti-establishment judge, who do you want? Craig Revel Horwood from Strictly? Judge Dredd? Hello and welcome to Quite Right. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketchwriter at The Spectator.
This week we'll be looking at the smoking ruin that is the Home Office.
And in the eternal battle between landlords and tenants, where should power really lie?
And we'll also be asking, in the wake of Justin Trudeau and Katy Perry coming out as a couple, what does that tell us about politicians, pop, and the relationship between the two?
Michael and I have a parish announcement to make. From next week, Quite Right will be airing 2 episodes a week, one in the usual way and the other a bonus episode that will go out on Friday morning.
So we're inviting you, Spectator subscribers, to submit urgent questions, such as, Michael, what does Rod Liddle really like in the pub? Maddie, is Douglas Murray as witty as he appears on page in real life? And Michael, how on earth can you possibly hold your head up in public after 14 disastrous Tory years? Whatever you'd like to ask, go to spectator.co.uk/quite right and you can submit your question there. And then we'll answer as many as we can next week.
Michael, it's been, I would think it's fair to say, a pretty torrid week for the Home Office. On Friday, we learnt of the deeply embarrassing accidental release of Hadush Kabatu, the Ethiopian asylum seeker who was convicted of assaulting a schoolgirl in Epping and was somehow released into the population. This came just a few days after the similarly humiliating report that an Iranian migrant who had been removed to France on the one-in, one-out pilot scheme had returned to Britain on a small boat. And then there is the apparent collapse of the grooming gang's inquiry. On Monday, Nigel Farage led a press conference alongside a survivor who denounced the whole process in absolute terms and said that Jess Phillips, the safeguarding minister, had explicitly lied to her. I mean, it's fair to say it's been a pretty bad week for a department which is very rare that the Home Office can be said to have had a good week.
You're absolutely right. It is the, in a hotly contested field, the most dysfunctional department in government. And of course, there are things elsewhere in government that go wrong. The Ministry of Defence is rubbish at procurement. When I was DEFRA secretary, the Rural Payments Agency, which was responsible for handing out payments to farmers, was slower than an arthritic sloth in making sure that the cash got to the front line. Each government department has its weaknesses, but there is something about the Home Office, and this was brought out in a report also published this week by Nick Timothy, the Conservative MP who was commissioned by the last government to do an investigation into the Home Office, that laid bare exactly what was wrong with that department. And of course, you've seen Home Office ministers dragged to the dispatch box for urgent questions or coming under a critique from the Select Committee, the Home Affairs Select Committee. So you will have seen how difficult it is. But there are a legion of examples that I remember of things going wrong in the Home Office that in any other department might have been front page news, but because the Home Office is the ne plus ultra of dysfunction, were completely sidelined by the even bigger scandals of the kind that you mentioned.
Is there a sense that the Home Office has got so big and unwieldy that it cannot? Because I think this has been a theme of some of the scandals over the years. For example, the loss of data of the Windrush arrivals, for example. It's a sense of maybe computer says no, like an unwieldy bureaucracy that is just unfit for purpose.
There are a huge number of things that are wrong, but you're absolutely right that part of it is the totally unwieldy nature of the bureaucracy within. When the phrase not fit for purpose was first used about the Home Office, it was John Reid, and he was talking then about the data systems, the management information systems within the Home Office. But he was also talking about the problem that arose from being responsible for policing, migration, counter-terrorism, national security, and prisons. So prisons were taken out and put into the Ministry of Justice, which I'm sure we'll touch on in a second, because there are a whole bag of problems that David Lammy, the Justice Secretary, has as well. But in the Home Office itself, I remember on one occasion when I was community secretary, and our job was to try to get people into the country from Ukraine. There was something called the Homes for Ukraine scheme. We were encouraging mothers and children from Ukraine to be given refugee status here in the UK. Generally, the Home Office's problem is allowing people into the country who shouldn't be. Here, their problem was preventing people coming to the country who should come. And the problem was exactly as you say with the data system. There were 3 different computer systems in 3 different geographical locations, none of which could talk to one another. So the process by which visas were processed and handed out was utterly dysfunctional. The Home Office obviously has existed for decades. This is its core business. But the sort of thing that Ryanair or British Airways, well, I don't know about British Airways, but certainly Ryanair, would handle relatively seamlessly, though expensively, the Home Office couldn't. I was so frustrated, as was Priti Patel, that I suggested that some of the teams come in and work at the weekend and be paid double time in order to process the claims. This was reluctantly accepted. When I asked how many people would be coming in after we'd made this offer at the weekend, the Director General in charge of this area at the Home Office said to me, well, we don't know, we'll just have to wait to see. And I said, look, I'm sorry, this isn't a village fete. These are people being evacuated from a war zone. You can't tell me how many people will be turning up at the office on Saturday.
And also with Village Fate, they usually do make the right amount of cake. You know what I mean? It's
completely.
This is, if only it was organised with that level of expertise.
Yeah, no, if the WI ran the Home Office, we'd all be in a much better situation. But purely for raising my voice on that occasion, I was then reported for bullying.
By whom? By the civil service?
By the civil service. And the then permanent secretary at the Home Office, a chap called Matthew Rycroft, who has a diplomatic background, had a word with my permanent secretary, Sarah Healy. And so I was gently chided for bullying. Now, some people might think that you really shouldn't raise your voice in a meeting or display exasperation. And I suspect it probably wasn't the most polite way of registering my discontent. But the broader point remains that when it comes to these issues, who should be in the country, whether we should attempt to keep criminals out or deport them, or indeed support genuine refugees in coming in, these are critically important decisions. And I remember when I pointed out my frustration, being told, well, you shouldn't criticise the team because they're an award-winning team.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
And I'm not sure whether that was an award for the intra-Whitehall strictly ballroom or the, DEI Olympics or whatever, but it certainly wasn't an award for efficiency. And this is part of the challenge, which is that overall within government, the ability of politicians to push the Home Office or any department to deliver is constrained. And that's what did for my friend Amber Rudd. You mentioned the Windrush scandal. That was a data disaster, data-geddon. The problem there is that Amber was given the wrong information and she took the fall. And the problem always is that there have been successive Home Office ministers, Beverly Hughes, Charles Clarke, Amber, who have all taken the fall for what have been internal problems, which they are parliamentarily accountable for, but they don't have the levers to alter.
Yes, precisely. And there's many areas of government in which this is the case. And I think with the growth of quangos and these arm-length bodies, you also have this problem of, actual decision-making capacity being pulled, but accountability is never pulled. The public do not see it that way. It's always the politicians that take the blame. So I think it's something that, frankly, more politicians should be against, because they ultimately will be the people who bear the brunt of it all.
Completely, and hiding behind an arm's length body, whether it's the Migration Advisory Committee or whether it's any other non-departmental public body, is an evasion of responsibility. That's why I know as we're recording, Danny Kruger is speaking about the need to have a greater degree of ministerial control and direct accountability. and he's right. Now, some people will say, of course, you were in government for 14 years, Michael. You should be apologising for this. The challenge is that if you are taking an approach like that, that you need everyone across government to back you. It can't be the case that one or even two or three ministers attempt to take matters into their own hand, because the system overall is there to resist them. The other thing is that the senior ranks of the Home Office or have been filled with people who don't display any particular relish, quite the opposite, for some of the tough measures that are required. So a senior civil servant who was at the heart of the immigration and nationality team after they left the civil service while I was in government, went off to work for Amnesty International. Now, fantastic charity, but the whole point about Amnesty is that it is there essentially on the bleeding heart liberal progressive let everyone in kumbaya wing of politics, and you want to have a tough bar steward being in charge of immigration and nationality, and the Home Office hasn't had that type of civil service leadership for as long as I can remember.
Yes, another theme of what you say that strikes me is a real reluctance in the upper echelons of the civil service to take any action that would potentially see the civil service behaving more like a functioning business.
Yes.
And this thing of, for example, not knowing the most basic data. I remember once sketching an appearance before, I think it was the Home Affairs Select Committee, that would make sense, which was Matthew Rycroft and a colleague called something Ridley. Rycroft and Ridley was a great duo. It sounds a bit like some kind of high-end hat maker or something. But they were there, and I think they were questioned by the whole committee, and there were many areas in which it became clear that they didn't know the most basic data about how many channel migrants were arriving, including data that was actually widely available on the internet. It wasn't that they didn't have the figures to hand because their officials hadn't briefed them. It was that they genuinely didn't know things that you would expect a fairly low-level journalist writing on that to know the data. There was really no excuse for it, but there was a sort of almost irritation that they had been asked to shed some light on their own department.
It's tragic because there are lots of people within government and within the civil service who are super smart on it and efficient. But the incentives of people, particularly in the senior ranks of the civil service, are not there to be effective managers. It's there to fulfill a sort of super HR function. And this is brought out in Nick Timothy's report, where he talks about the way in which people are invited to bring their whole self to work. The way in which there are so-called listening circles within the Home Office. What's a listening circle? Essentially, it's civil servants talking to one another about their feelings. And I remember that senior civil servants would often regard their duty or responsibility as how well their department did, not in clearing asylum backlogs or in even measuring how many prisoners were being put usefully to work, but how well their department did in internal Whitehall wellbeing surveys or staff satisfaction surveys. And again, nobody wants civil servants to feel unnecessarily unhappy, but this whole concentration on feeling and bringing your whole self to work militates against the professionalism necessary to actually do what the civil service is there to do, which is to serve society and the electorate.
It also feels very on brand somehow for the British state in general to have doubled down on this sort of thing just at the very moment when businesses are laying off their HR staff. We had, I would say, peak woke a few years ago. DEI schemes are being rolled back, etc., and the civil service is still powwowing like there's no tomorrow.
Completely, and it's a sense that across the public sector, there is a general failure to appreciate that we're living in times where money is tighter, tolerance for the luxury beliefs of a few years ago is lower. That doesn't mean that a working environment suddenly has to be the kind that Romans would have imposed on galley slaves. It does mean, though, that there does need to be a proper focus on the core task. And again, we're uncomfortably reminded of who loses out by the grooming gangs inquiry, as you pointed out at the beginning. Because one might say at certain points, oh, well, this is a ministerial preoccupation. It's the role of civil servants to, push back and question the wisdom of ministers. But the horlicks that Jess Phillips and the government have made of the grooming gangs inquiry is much, much more than a Westminster spectacle or a Whitehall mismanagement exercise. It is the hanging out to dry of people who've suffered the most horrific crimes.
Yes, the criticism from many survivors is that there was a panel that was looking into overseeing the inquiry, finding a chair and the terms of reference. And the Home Office, by inserting victims into the panel who were not explicitly victims of grooming, were victims of other types of sexual crimes, there is now a widely held fear that that is an attempt to broaden the terms of the inquiry and thereby filtering down or diluting the racial and cultural aspect of the grooming abuse scandal. Do you think that is that? I mean, that is my understanding of it, but
yes.
Obviously there's a lot that's only a certain amount. We don't know the full facts at present, but that has been strongly suggested.
That is certainly what's been reported, and it seems as though there are a group of people who undeniably have suffered at the hands of abusive men, and there is a huge question, of course, about sexual exploitation overall and how we tackle it. But the particular problem with the grooming gangs was that for years, arguably decades, we've had a situation where people overwhelmingly from within a particular community, the Pakistani diaspora community, and their allies and confederates, but particularly from within that community, operated in a way where there was inadequate scrutiny because people explicitly were worried about accusations of racism. So, at the heart of the need for this inquiry is concern that a well-meaning but misplaced desire to protect community tensions, or to avert community tensions and to protect community cohesion, meant that girls, overwhelmingly white working-class girls, were treated, in the words of Jack Straw, former Labour Home Secretary, as easy meat. So it goes to the heart of it. One of the things that I find perplexing in a way is that Jess Phillips, who spent her entire career before going into Parliament working with women who had been abused and mistreated by men, can't see that, or appears not to. I mean, you've seen her respond to criticism in the House of Commons. Where do you think her motivations in the handling of this whole issue lie?
Well, I think Jess Phillips, in that exchange that you refer to, looked exceptionally rattled, angry. I detected real annoyance that she was being asked these questions. I do think, and perhaps I'm being unkind, you may disagree, I think Jess Phillips spent a lot of time in opposition pointing the finger and frankly bigging up herself and her own credentials. I think she developed something of a sort of maybe even a heroine complex. And now that she's in the very difficult position of having to manage all of this amid a backdrop of her own constituency, which, frankly, the size of the Muslim representation in her constituency has created, I think, an incentive to attempt to try and avoid upsetting them. And so she has this double conflict from her role as a minister and her own constituency, which was a horrible atmosphere at the last general election. But I think Jess Phillips is angry at being criticised because she felt she could do no wrong. But actually having to manage the inquiry is very different to, for example, raising the important issue of women killed by male violence in the chamber, which is the kind of action that she took, which I think was very valuable. But that's a world of difference to actually being in charge of everything and having to take responsibility for it. Kind of goes back to our earlier theme about accountability, really.
Feeling someone's pain, having genuine empathy, is a noble thing, but if you're a minister, it is no substitute for effective delivery. And for victims, there is an ocean of sympathy, but there hasn't been a single drop of justice. And that is, I think, at the heart of it. And Jess Phillips, before she was appointed, I think, or around the time that she was appointed, wrote that she was the single best person, I think, in the country, in the world, to be doing
In the
this job.
world.
And undoubtedly, there are few people who devoted more of their time and energy before coming to office to an issue for which they are then made the responsible minister. And that's, a qualification of sorts. But the real qualification is delivery. And that's, I think, why she feels that when she's criticised, people are criticising the sincerity of her motivation. I don't think anyone is. They're criticising the effectiveness of delivery. But added to which is your point, which I think is absolutely spot on. Whether or not it's because of her own constituency position, having nearly lost her seat to a Gaza independent candidate, or more broadly an issue within the Labour Party, it's still the case that with some very honourable exceptions, Labour are deeply uncomfortable in acknowledging the inevitably ethnic, community and religious element to this crime. And it's, I think, one of the reasons why Shabana Mahmood is the right person to be Home Secretary, in that she's been very clear. She was clear before Louise Casey, the government's sort of all-purpose problem-solving czarina, said that there should be an inquiry. She was very clear that there should be a sort of truth and reconciliation inquiry. And one would have thought that Shabana Mahmood's leadership on this would have given Jess Phillips the cover to move. But as things stand, we still find that we don't have a chair for the inquiry, that a social worker last week decided to walk away from consideration, and also a former police officer, Jim Gamble, decided to withdraw. It's almost impossible to know. Do you have a view on the type of person who should lead an inquiry of this kind?
It's so difficult, isn't it, with a scandal that is engulfing so many different institutions across the British state. I mean, I wonder about what Nigel Farage was saying on Monday, which was that the select committees ought to take on a greater role and responsibility, calling witnesses, using the unique power that Parliament has to compel people to come and be seen and spoken to, and get them in and question them in-house, as it were. I worry greatly about, for example, the COVID inquiry that I think was frankly doomed as soon as they announced the terms of reference, which was so unbelievably broad. But that has been trundling along for years, and it's recently passed the mark of £192 million. It's barely scratched the surface. It will probably be the most expensive in British history. I really think it would be important to avoid something like this that reports its findings many years after the fact. And in fact, we're already many years after the events of the grooming gangs. I wonder if something short and extremely targeted. And I do actually question the motivations of the government, because I cannot think why you would want to, in a inquiry looking into grooming gangs specifically, include other forms of sexual abuse when we have already had the ICSA report, which was, I think, chaired by Alexis Jay.
Yes.
Incredibly wide-ranging, that covered all sorts of forms of sexual abuse. That has already reported. And in Parliament, I noticed before the Labour Party agreed to have a proper inquiry into grooming, they would generally cite the ICSA report as evidence that they, had taken it seriously, or that it wasn't necessary. So I wonder why now they have taken this course of action.
Yes, and they have resisted, or they've stated resistance to having a judge, because they argue that appointing a judge would delay things unnecessarily. I can understand on one basis, because judge-led inquiries do, almost by their definition, take longer. Look at the COVID inquiry. I remember before Alexis Jay was appointed, being in a meeting with David Cameron and Theresa May and others, when there was a search going on for an appointee. Because part of the atmosphere that generated a demand for an inquiry at that time were allegations of establishment, as it was called, child exploitation, allegations which were subsequently proven to be a fiction generated by a fantasist, a man called Carl Beach. But because there were allegations about Leon Britton, the former Home Secretary, and other establishment figures, I remember that when I suggested a couple of judges in the meeting, one of the people in the meeting saying, we can't have a judge because they would be an establishment figure. And I said, everyone who might be considered eligible would be seen as an establishment figure. I mean, if you want an anti-establishment judge, who do you want? Craig
Johnny
Revel Horwood from Strictly, Judge Dredd. In the end, we went to New Zealand for a judge. It was subsequently discovered that in New Zealand there's a sort of league table of how well judges perform, and this poor judge was bottom of the league table.
Naturally.
So eventually Alexis J was appointed. But my own preference here would be, even though some of the victims have expressed concern about these, to appoint a really tough, proven, no-nonsense copper who's investigated malfeasance in the past. And I think absolutely the right person would be Peter Clark, former Assistant Commissioner of the Met, who's investigated a range of issues and who can be trusted to investigate without fear or favour.
Yeah, and it's important, I think, that the terms of reference are very focused.
Yes.
Into these specific aspects of abuse. I think if you compare the COVID inquiries that we've been doing, for example, and Sweden had a sort of task force, I think it was in Sweden, where they managed to report their findings. I think they were given the necessary powers to compel people to appear, etc. But it wasn't conducted publicly for a start. It was, which may have led to greater candour and less theatricality. I don't know. But they managed to report their findings before we had even set our terms of reference.
Part of the problem with judge-led inquiries is not so much the judge, it's the fact that the counsel to the inquiry is a barrister. And obviously there are some notable exceptions to this rule. But if you're the barrister and you're counsel to an inquiry, you play to the gallery.
Of course, yes.
So you've seen that with the COVID inquiry. You have seen the sort of peacockery of the bar. And I remember having appeared at the COVID inquiry, having appeared at the Leveson inquiry, counsel to the inquiry presents themselves initially as a disinterested seeker after truth, but really they're playing a game of gotcha.
Yes, and they have specific hoops that they want you to jump through.
Totally.
Yes.
And I fear the same would be the case with a parliamentary inquiry, which is why I think that the most effective and rapid way of getting at things would be to have a tight unit led by an effective investigator. And that's why I think having a police officer who has the correct experience would be right. And also, given that we know, or we're pretty certain, that some of the malfeasance occurring by police officers on the ground was from people who have some sort of corrupt relationship, there is nobody that is more motivated to root out corrupt police officers than an honest one. Anyway, I don't want to go all line of duty on this too much, because we need to reflect on another topic, Maddie, where I think you're going to be doing the interrogating of me, and I'm going to be the person sweating guiltily as they attempt to defend themselves, because you're going to explain the agonies of being a landlord, and I'm going to try to explain why I introduced legislation that may have made their life more difficult.
Yes, well, I would never try to claim that being a landlord is inevitably agony, but I do just want to share a very horrible ordeal that my family have been going through. My mother is a landlord. She has a small cottage that adjoins her house, and she rented this out for some years. She's recently managed to evict a tenant who had stopped paying rent, basically, for the best part of a year. The relationship had gone from fairly harmonious to acrimonious in the extreme. My mother found, for example, that this tenant had grown abusive. She would not allow entry into the property. She stopped paying rent, stopped paying her utility bills. And it took, in the end, the best part of a year to evict this tenant after she stopped paying her rent. The complexity of the process was truly astonishing. And because this kind of nightmare scenario had not happened to us before, we didn't realise just how little the British state was on the side of a decent person who has done nothing wrong. The cost of instructing lawyers was extreme. By the time I think all of the legal bills had been paid, we were looking at over £20,000 on legal bills, in addition to over £20,000 in rent arrears and unpaid utility bills, which is a pretty staggering amount of money. upon finally entering the building, we had to go to the High Court to get High Court enforcement because the county court system was so backlogged that the quickest thing to do would be to go to the High Court, which was further expense. But I think my mother just wanted to resolve this situation as soon as possible, because to have an abusive tenant next door, it was, a very scary time. So anyway, we got the High Court officials. When we finally gained access to the property, it was quite indescribable. There was this tenant had too many dogs, far too many dogs, and she had been breeding them. We tried to speak to the RSPCA about this, but to no avail. Something like 30 dogs were living at the property. There was just dog mess all over the place. The state gave not a hoot about this. It couldn't give a damn about what happened. At every step of the way, local government was no help at all. You'd speak to the local council and they would say, oh, your only recourse is to go to the law, which will cost a fortune. We also learned that the local council was advising the tenant to stay put because they don't want the responsibility of housing somebody. So in that sense, we were completely alone. We tried to get Warwickshire Police to do something about the home invasion, and they said, there's nothing we can do. It was a kind of parable of state inactivity. And it kind of made me think that the social contract is broken, because in my mother, and I know I'm obviously biased because it's my mother, but she's a kind person who has always had good relationships with her tenants until now and has given them discounts during COVID and stuff. She's paid a lot of tax over the course of her life and obeys the law. When it comes down to it, the state will take the side of the crook against you, and they will not lift a finger to help you. So it has left me, the whole experience has left me very depressed, very disenchanted. And it also makes me worry about what's going to come next with the Renters Reform Bill, which, it got royal assent this week. And one thing that really alarms me, even though the tenant that we had was evicted on Section 8, which is to do with non-payment of rent, and it's Section 21, which is no fault eviction, has just been banned. So this wouldn't have affected us in that respect. I think it will make the problem worse because it basically envisages a much greater role for the courts in the eviction process. So the experience we have told me that the courts are in such a dysfunctional state that you're going to see innocent landlords who have to wait months and months and months and spend a fortune to evict tenants because there's no room for the courts to hear it. So that's just one example of how I think the situation could be worse. And my advice to any landlords listening is get out now while you still can, because it's not worth it.
I do sympathise with the pain that your mother felt because of having to go to court and finding the courts were clogged. That was one of the issues that arose when we were trying to put forward our own version, which is slightly different from the government's, of renters reform. But it was also the case that we were told that if we went ahead with this, that a significant number of existing landlords would just quit the market. And that is, I think, it's not the only test, but it is a test of whether or not the legislation is in the right place.
Yes, and I understand why landlords are not flavour of the month. And I think especially in our cities, those who are securely housed and not living in a city have no idea of the kind of Wild West that you can see, particularly in London, but also other cities in the UK, where a property emerges and there might be dozens, hundreds of often young people in their 20s going around this flat to look for it. I get that. And there is such a thing as a rogue landlord. And I think it's right that tenants are protected from them. We have, for example, a rogue landlords register where they can be put into some kind of database so renters can know not to fall into that trap. There's no equivalent protection for landlords against rogue tenants. I wonder if one unintended consequence, and your point about landlords departing the market is very important, but I wonder if another unintended consequence of what has just gone through the Commons is that landlords will now be much more careful, much more exacting about who they take.
Yes.
So they will want to see much more in the way of credentials, credit scores, will be more alert to things like county court judgments, which is an entirely sensible thing to do. But I wonder if this would potentially harm, let's say, young people who have just graduated from university or just got a place of their own or just entered the jobs market and they don't have a long track record of renting that they can point to. Families, freelancers, people who are potentially not such a good bet on paper, but perfectly decent. Landlords now will not take a chance on them, because why would you when you can just be burnt like this?
Yeah, it is certainly the case that the tide has moved against, or certainly the climate has become more difficult for landlords, with an impact therefore on tenants. And it used to be the case funnily enough, at the beginning of the coalition years, that the number of private rented properties was increasing, not least because there was a direct tax benefit that if you or I are paying our mortgage, we can't write the interest off against tax. It happened under Margaret Thatcher, then was abolished by Nigel Lawson. But if you were a landlord, you could because it was a business.
Yeah.
That was removed by George Osborne because he wanted to create a level playing field between people who were buying homes to live in and people who were buying homes to rent.
Yes.
And so you had a situation where people...
Which is very reasonable.
It's reasonable in itself, but where people thought, well, I bought this property on one basis and suddenly the tax treatment's a bit tougher, then... on top of that, there are new standards, some of which I would absolutely defend, that homes have to be decent, others of which I think are onerous, like some of the insulation and climate requirements, which are piling costs on the private rented sector at the moment.
Is that net zero related?
Yes.
Yes.
Where I think the ultimate goal is fair enough, but the costs at the moment are too much. And this is all about balance and proportionality. And this is where the most difficult thing is for me, because
it is.
I think that the original intention of the Renters' Bill, which is to get rid of no-fault evictions, is right, because it was being abused by landlords in order to say to people, accept this huge rent increase, or I'll evict you. And also, when tenants were objecting about the conditions of the flat, they were told, right.
Absolutely.
You object to it being damp, you object to mould, you object to
dozens
the fact
of
that
people I could bring in who will not object. Yes.
Exactly.
No,
You're
these
out.
things, this is what I mean by the Wild West. These things have been happening.
Exactly.
And I completely support cracking down on them.
And my view was that the relationship there between a landlord and tenant gave the landlord a certain amount of power. Now, some people might say, well, why not just leave it to the market? Well, there are two problems. One is the inequality of arms between landlord and tenant in those circumstances. And the related thing as well is that we're not talking about the termination of a contract with Sky. We're not talking about the end of a subscription. Imagine anyone ending their subscription to the Spectator. It's not like a standard commercial relationship. It is about someone's home. However, one of the things that I do realise is that it is possible to have a series of individual, well-intentioned steps on decent homes, getting rid of no-fault evictions, making homes warmer and more energy efficient. But if you pile them on, it's a bit like the childhood game Buckaroo.
Yes.
Where you pile too many bits of plastic on the back of the mule and the mule eventually just kicks.
Yes.
And that is genuinely an open concern of mine, because I worry now that we may see the flight of people from the private rented market that you mention. I still believe that the justice of getting rid of Section 21 is right. And without wanting to be sort of too defensive about it, it is the case that Labour made some changes to the bill that we introduced. So, for example, they've made it the case that if you go to a rent tribunal to challenge an unfair rent as a tenant, the rent can't increase as a result of that. We said actually it was up to the tribunal. And it could increase in order to reflect market conditions.
Even these tribunals, I mean, this seems like a, frankly, backdoor rent control where it's going to be determined by a tribunal and you wonder who will staff the tribunal and what they will say. It's one of the economic policies where there is so much empirical evidence, so much data from all over the round, every jurisdiction it's ever been tried in, that it makes the problem worse, that landlords depart and they don't maintain the properties to the highest standards because they have less incentive.
And there's a restriction on supply. And I think that's why I think beforehand, I would argue that having a tribunal that could properly reflect the market rent and could put it upwards was the right thing to do. And Labour, by putting a cap on that, I think have got it in the wrong place. But I also have to acknowledge something else as well, which is that if you have a properly staffed tribunal with people looking genuinely at what's going on in the market and unfair practice penalised, but actually the market conditions being reflected, that's one thing. But A, our courts are clogged, and B, there is evidence, as we've touched on in the past, of a sort of general leftward progressive drift in the way in which the entire legal system operates. So what I've got to acknowledge is that the whole court system as it operates at the moment is not the free-flowing black letter law model of the 1950s. We have a situation where your mother found the courts so clogged that they weren't working in her interests. And
they
also,
weren't working at all. You know, she had to take it directly to the High Court and pay an exorbitant sum in which to do that, because she was told that it would take so many months for it to see a county court. And even if there were a county court resolution, there's a shortage of bailiffs at the moment, meaning that the whole process could trundle on for months until there was a bailiff available. And I also just do think that I'm all for defending tenants against rogue landlords. I really am. But I think we've got to a point where the pendulum has gone so far in the opposite direction that there is like an absence of property rights, an absence of any kind of justice for people whose property has been destroyed. It is now the case that if somebody lives in a property, trashes it completely and pays no rent, the state will protect them and not the property owner who, through no fault of their own, has had such damage done to their belongings and their property. You know, it is an absence of natural justice.
Well, this takes me to two other things. One is, overall, part of the problem is the lack of housing overall.
Yes.
If there were simply more homes, then you'd have a more functioning market. The other thing is that there's been, I hesitate to say delicious irony, but certainly an irony in the fact that as this legislation has gone through, introduced by a Labour government, made more rigid by a Labour government than was the case when it was first introduced when Boris was Prime Minister, this legislation has had as its first two, not victims, but figures in the crosshairs, Labour MPs. So you had Rushna Ali, who was the homelessness
and
minister.
she did that thing that you described earlier, where there's a threat to jack up the rent, and if you can't pay it, then you'll be evicted. Like, she did that to her tenants. To be fair, it was legal at the time, but given what her government was doing,
quite. And then you also have the Ilford MP Jazz Atwell, who has been outed as a rogue landlord. It's a curious situation whereby Labour's legislation has highlighted the hypocrisy of some of its own MPs. I think that there is, I suppose, a lesson for us all, myself included, which is that there is no area more sensitive and more difficult to legislate over than housing, homes in the UK. I remember my very first sort of front bench job in government was as the shadow housing spokesman when David Cameron was leader of the opposition. And I remember then that the issue of the moment was home information packs, which was an attempt to make the process of selling and buying homes easier. In fact, it just added cost. Kirsty Allsop, absolutely heroic, wonderful person, helped us with a campaign against home information packs. It might seem recondite, but it engaged so much passion. The process, I think, for anyone in England, anyone in Britain, of acquiring a home is so important, so fraught, so difficult, so complicated, that the political territory is treacherous, but the prize for someone who gets it right, huge.
And is it not the case, though, that many of the symptoms of the broken housing market, including rogue landlords, I mean, part of the reason that they can behave in such a disgraceful way is because there is such a shortage in certain areas of the country and such very high demand that they know they can get away with this sort of behaviour. Much of what we've been doing seems to me tinkering around the edges, because until you grasp the real problem of supply, then everything else is just noise.
The thing that I have to be aware of is that even though I would defend the legislation that we brought in and I have sympathy with what actually this Labour government has been trying to do, there's a hard case, and that is your mother. And your mother is someone who has tried at every stage to do the right thing, to save in order to have something to hand on to her children, to work hard and to put it into bricks and mortar.
But it isn't just her, crucially.
No.
I know hard cases make bad laws, but if this can happen to
No.
her, it can happen to literally anyone.
Oh, completely.
You know?
So you're absolutely right to pick me up on the use of the word hard case, because it's not hard case in the sense that this is an exception that is an outlier. It is a proof point, because she extends kindness, generosity and forbearance to a tenant and has that abused. And then when she has recourse to the system in order to say, look, can I please, because I've been trying to be wholly independent of the state by saving, when I need your help in order to enforce the law, the state isn't there. And that raises lots of questions.
They were very happy to take her council tax and
Of course.
continue to take it after they sided with the person who was fleecing her. I think that is disgraceful from Warwickshire Council. Absolutely disgraceful. I assume they do so because it would be an additional expense to house another person and their statutory duties have gone through the roof. So I get they have a financial motive, but people should know this. Well, it should be understood, that the social contract, that is the state of it now.
You are, I'm afraid, absolutely right. The social contract in that respect is broken. We have an example here, another example of what I hate to acknowledge, but is accurately described as anarcho-tyranny. You have a tenant that behaves anarchically, but the state is only tyrannous towards your mother by making sure that she pays her council tax, but not defending her. And this, I think, goes beyond simply landlord-tenant relations to a whole landscape across the country, a difficult landscape to which we will return in later episodes. The picture on every newspaper's front page at the beginning of this week was Katy Perry in a scarlet dress and Justin Trudeau, the former Prime Minister of Canada, in a black suit with a black T-shirt, at what was their formal coming out. It was the hard launch of their relationship. So Justin and Katy had been pictured canoodling on a yacht. There'd been rumours of their relationship beforehand, that Katy Perry's rock star career and Justin Trudeau's political comeback were going to collide in an explosion of news and gossip. And so it came to pass this week. Now, I don't know about you, Maddie, but do you think there is something incongruous about the coupling of a Canadian Prime Minister and an LA rock babe? Or do you think that actually it's a beautiful thing?
Well, I think it depends on the Canadian Prime Minister, really. If it was Mark Carney and Katy Perry, that would be a bit harder to get your head around. But actually, I think part of Justin Trudeau's one explanation for his ineptitude was actually that he often behaved more like a celebrity than a politician. He loved grandstanding and hand-wringing. Also got into trouble for stuff in much the same way that celebrities often do, things from his earlier life, his unfortunate habit of blacking up, which also felt fairly incongruous. So in some ways he was always more celebrity than politician, and I wonder if now he's leaning into that a bit more and it's embracing his true self.
I think you're absolutely right about Justin Trudeau, that he exemplified a type, a subset of politicians who do seem to have, in his case, a sort of boyish matinee idol look to them, and who do seem entirely at home in showbiz world. I don't know who the Brit equivalents would be. I'd be fascinated to know who you think manages to combine that zing and, I hesitate to say, charisma. My own criticism of Justin Trudeau is not that he gets to step out with Katy Perry. Good luck to him, good luck to her. It is that for the hard launch in Paris, he chose to wear a suit with a T-shirt.
Oh, I missed this.
This seems to me to be a crime, not just for former prime ministers, but for any man over the age of 30. T-shirts are for the beach, the gym, or the bedroom. If you are wearing a suit, please wear a proper shirt and tie. In Katy Perry's defence, she was wearing this stunning and, I thought, very beautiful scarlet dress. And I think that Justin, in order to be worthy of Katy, has got to smarten up. But whether or not you agree with me on the sartorial fail that Justin Trudeau was responsible for, are there any UK equivalents of Justin? Would you say, for example, Matt Hancock?
Well, I think I'm not sure who comes off worst in that comparison. I think Matt Hancock would be delighted to have this level of attention. But actually, I would say both of them are punching above their weight with women. So that's a similarity between Matt Hancock and the beautiful Gina Coladangelo and Trudeau Perry. When did politicians stop wearing a tie? Because I feel like it's been happening in a gradual process. When I was a child, I felt like it was mandatory, and there's been a general loosening and relaxation to a point now where Keir Starmer will often go to an important global summit wearing his like quite weird sort of geography teacher outfit where it's like a kind of dark shirt, almost looking a bit sheeny, sort of like, I think maybe he's a Brit, sort of, he likes Oasis, so maybe he's a Britpop element, kind of sheeny 90s shirt with a very similarly coloured jacket and no tie at all, which I think is a terrible look.
Well, the politician, the front-rank politician who is now never seen with a tie, and indeed very rarely in a suit, is Andy Burnham. Who, again, I'm no judge of these things, but I suppose if there were a UK politician who were to have the Justin Trudeau look, the languorous eyelashes, the dark hair, and, as I say, the fondness for T-shirts and cash, it would be Andy Burnham. I think the broader...
And that slight sense of desperation as well, which is very important.
Well... Again, your words. But the whole movement, the whole informality, again, I think, has a feel of the Britpop Blair years melding into the early coalition years. I thought the other great Paris fashion shot of last week, which shows that perhaps the tide is turning, is you may have seen a picture that went viral of the police outside the Louvre, and next to the police officers who were investigating the theft of the Bonaparte crown jewels, there was someone who was assumed to be a detective. In fact, it turns out was just a passing French citizen.
Oh, what a pity.
Who was there in an impeccable fedora, waistcoat, tie, tweed jacket. And the fact that that image went viral in admiration made me think that
there is hope.
That whatever one thinks of Justin Trudeau's good taste in girlfriends, his bad taste in fashion was shown up by this gentilhomme who was so debonair.
Yes. I love it when countries actually accord with your national stereotype. You know, when you go to Italy and you have these unbelievably, frankly, quite sexy attired. I don't know if they wouldn't be called the gendarmerie, obviously, but the equivalent.
Oh yes,
they tend to be. They wear very tight outfits, extremely camp outfits, which feels like quite an Italian thing to do, and they often kind of mooch around flexing their muscles in the town square, which again feels very Italian. It's not the classic comedy inept coppers of the Benny Hill show. It's not the British way. It feels distinctively Italian, and I'm just sad that this wasn't actually a real detective, because that would have been perfect if it turned out they actually had sort of Clouseau-ish figures populating the service. Or what's he called? René. Not Poirot. What's the French one? Maigret. There we go. Maigret.
I quite agree. I mean, and I think you're right. I think that French detectives should always be impeccably tailored and pomaded. Italian police officers, as you point out, you know, whether they're Bastiglieri or whatever, will be wearing figure-hugging body armour and stroking their carbines in the public square. British police officers, as you point out, far too often are the person who, if they were to appear on the football field, would be met with a cry of "Who ate all the pies?"
Yes.
You know, the British police, particularly at Macy, around the parliamentary estate, do look as though they've had several Twixes too many for most of their adult life.
They're more Chief Wiggum than the Thompson twins these days.
Completely.
Alas.
And I think that British detectives or police officers should be, Foyle's War style, suitably elegant. Of course, with Grantchester, we have a tradition of clerical detectives as well, again, impeccably turned out. But that matching of profession with style, I think, sadly, no longer exists in the way that it should. And it comes back, of course, to the way in which politicians dress, because, as you quite rightly point out, the increasing informality that exists everywhere means that for a subset of people in public life is less about public service than about saying to the public, hi, we do see I think a proper pride in appearance is a good thing. It's respectful to others, not to be slobbish. But you do have, as Justin Trudeau exemplifies, a streak of something that is closer to vanity or peacockery here. And again, I thought it was striking that when Nigel Farage was speaking at the Reform Conference, someone who's generally prided or who takes pride in being a bluff, tough Englishman, had a made-to-measure turquoise suit with Union Jack brogues and socks. And I got the sense then that maybe Nigel was succumbing ever so slightly to the lure of the grease paint.
Well, at the Reform Conference, he turned up in a normal suit for his first address, and then for his second, he came on wearing that turquoise suit, and he pretended to kind of take it off. The crowd were loving it. It was, I don't know, it's very camp, and it's interesting to me that I know we did a fantastic cover by Gareth Roberts about the campness of Reform Conference, but I do think it's kind of interesting because it's the only conference that feels American in that way, that feels more like an RNC or a DNC, like a big public, quite pantomime in places event. The only party that feels comfortable enough in itself to actually pull it off at the moment is Reform UK, and I think that's kind of actually explains part of their success in the same way that Trump's campness, I think, is also crucial to his success. Earlier on, you said about, to take it back to Katy Perry Justin Trudeau, you said that it was a hard launch, which interests me because that sort of implies that it's almost like not a real relationship. It's is that how you think? It's a PR type thing. It's like the launch of a new iPhone rather than two people just out at an event together.
No, I do think it's a real relationship, but I think the thing is that they're both so media conscious that for both of them, for Justin Trudeau, having lost office. I mean, obviously his successor Mark Carney went on to win the general election, but having sort of bundled out of office is a bit of an embarrassment to the Canadian Liberal Party. He wants to show that there's life in the old.
I wonder if Mark Carney will end up with Adele after he's stepped up.
Are you very possibly? Or Beyonce? I mean, I don't know. But there is also something about the terminal tedium which is associated with Canada, and in particular with Canadian politics, having this injection of glamour. But the other thing is also, you probably know better than me, whether or not Katy Perry feels slightly last decade.
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask. I mean, I probably know less current music than... You have children of the right age, so you probably know more than me.
No, I think they're probably less Katy Perry fans, but I think for me, I think the really interesting combo would be if you were to get, I don't know, David Lammy and Lily Allen together. I know David Lammy is very happily married. No aspersions being cast there. Terribly sorry. But I think, I
Lily Lammy is a great name, though.
Exactly. I can't think what the perfect sort of Brit equivalent of Justin and Katy would be. Again, it might be the case that if you had, I don't know, Bridget Phillipson and Harry Styles.
Oh my God.
That might be.
You just love an older lady.
Well, there you go. That might be the combo. And again, I don't know if one were to get, for the sake of argument, Tom Tugendhat and Chapel Roan. I don't know. With
I'm not sure he's her type.
No. The possibilities are endless. I hope that our listeners will let us know what they think would be the best pop and politics pairing that you could have. It would be intriguing to find out. Or do you think that this is just a relevant slop and that we should be getting back to discussing the deficit and what Rachel Reeves should do about it. Anyway, there'll be an opportunity for you to let us know, and we look forward to you joining us again next week.